kind of a long title for this opening keynote, but I based it kind of on some reading that I've done on Klaas's work and his thinking and some back and forth phone calls that we had over the last half year, I guess. So it's titled Intentional Biodiversity and Whole Farm Systems Thinking as Keys to Resilient Organic Farming. Okay, so we're going to let him explore that and sort of take us down the rabbit hole of exactly what that might mean, but wanted to give the proper introduction for Klaas. So Klaas and Mary Howe Martens own Lakeview Organic Grain in Pinyon, New York. Together with their son Peter, the family farms 1,700 acres of diversified crops. Klaas was a successful conventional farmer for 20 years before transitioning to organic in 1992. Crops include corn, soybean, edamame, edible dry beans, spelt, wheat, barley, triticale, oats, rye, emmer, einkorn, Austrian winter pea, sorghum, Sudan grass, buckwheat, clover, alfalfa, vegetables, milk heifers, and seed crops. Okay, there's more than corn in New York. The farm recently built a state-of-the-art bean and seed cleaning facility with optical sorting equipment. Klaas is a member of and serves on multiple boards surrounding the farm. He works closely with Cornell, as we started to hear about yesterday, if you were here, and serves on several advisory committees for the university. So with that, Klaas, I'd like to hand it over to you. You're mic'd up.
Okay. And thank you.
Good, everybody's here for learning, knowledge, education. Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody.
So I'm going to give a challenge to you on this. I was, like I was introduced, I was a conventional farmer for 20 years. And I felt that I was pretty good at it, except for one thing. I wasn't making a good enough living. In the 80s, corn prices were rotten. I spent a lot of time calculating how much money I could afford to lose on my corn crop to get the subsidy. In those days, the subsidies ran $200-300 an acre, and you really couldn't afford to pass that up. But I had very good records. And one of the gifts of Cornell University was a very good ag economics department, and there was a discipline that I learned from way back of keeping tight records, because when the money is short, you've got to watch every penny. And one thing those records showed was when we had a diversity, when the corn was grown in rotation, it cost me less and it yielded better overall than when I was growing corn on corn. In fact, the only corn that I was in the black on some years was the corn that was following a legume, either hay or clover, because I didn't have to buy the nitrogen and I didn't have near the herbicide bill when I was doing that. The problem was the way the farm economy was set up at that time, I could not afford to walk away, or didn't think I could afford to walk away from the big subsidies. And the diverse crops were a problem. I used to quip that growing rye and selling it at the local agway was only marginally more profitable than growing rye and pouring it in the ditch, because the prices were just so lousy for everything except corn and soybeans. We had lots of ideas for niches. Most of them rotten, most of them didn't work, but we kept thinking we had to find a way to make a better living. One day we saw an ad in the paper from a mill that was advertising for organic wheat, and they were offering $6 a bushel, which, if you think back into the 80s, the elevator was paying $2.50. And I went through all the numbers of how much lower yield could we take, and was this something worth a try? And we tried a lot of things that hadn't worked, so I felt like when you're in a business where you're losing money on a lot of acres, the risk of trying something different wasn't terribly high, and the most I could lose was my inputs. But that was the beginning, but it brought a revelation. As soon as I signed up to grow organic wheat, I started getting phone calls from buyers. And they were saying, well, do you have organic corn? Do you have organic soybeans? Do you have organic other things? And that was a new experience, because I'd always been in the business of smile and dial. You call everybody who buys what you've got and take the best lousy price. In fact, I started getting people asking how much I wanted for growing something. That was a really new idea. And at the same time, though, the crops that I wanted to grow corn and soybeans, at that time, there wasn't a huge organic market. The stuff other people wanted were these other crops. The biggest market at that time was the food grade soybeans, which are harder to grow and they yield less, but the Japanese at that had just discovered organic tofu made with a variety called Vinton 81. Anyone here remember Vinton 81s? That was the driver that started an organic market. And it actually created a near train wreck for a lot of organic farms, because farmers were growing Vinton 81s and rotating only because the certifier, the blankety blank certifier, was requiring them to plant something else in between growing Vinton 81s. And the other thing about what New York was like at the time, I went to Cornell and went to Extension when we were looking at organic, and wanted to learn what I could about organic. And unlike you today in this situation with Michael here, when I went to our extension specialist, he said, well, that's something that may work for some hippies in their backyard for the garden, but it would never be conceivable on a field scale. Don't even try it. That was all the encouragement I needed. There's a little bit of in your face about me on something when someone tells me I can't do something. But I did discover there were 5 other farmers in our state at the time who were growing organic field crops. And they didn't have enough markets. The only thing they had enough market for was the Vinton 81 soybean. They did something that to me seemed really foolish based on my training, because when you found a niche that made money, you don't tell anybody about it. In fact, I looked at growing processing vegetables. That was one of the dumb ideas I had earlier. And I found that people were telling me things wrong to get me in trouble because they didn't want me competing with them. So I went to the organic farmers, and they not only told me how they grew their crops, but they told me where they were marketing the stuff that they couldn't get rid of. So they were only selling part of their corn, they were only selling part of their oats, and yet they did the foolish thing of telling a large potential competitor and sharing markets that they didn't have enough of. Make a long story short, I learned something new about economics. By the end of that year, none of us had enough to fill the demand. So they gave away something they were short of and ended up with more. And I really learned something from these other farmers that way, because they were willing to help me. They were willing to tell me, I want you to succeed. And I'll have to make a confession. This is part of my being a conventional farmer. It used to be on Sunday after church, we would drive around and this guy's not doing so good. And oh, I hear he might not make it through next year. Be a chance to have an auction and buy something he's got. And of course, all the neighbors were doing that with us too. And I remember my wife pointing out to me, said, you know what you're doing? That kind of hurt, because it was true. How can you have a community when every one of our neighbors is a takeover candidate? It's really hard to cooperate and want to be part of a group where we all feel there's not enough, and I've got to have yours so that there's enough for me. So this was mindset really changed and really challenged my sense of who I wanted to be. And because of that, we started meeting as a group. We started out with 5 farmers around a kitchen table. It started to grow, and we started working with Extension. Cornell University supplied us with a venue, and Cornell Extension started working with this group of farmers. And what we would do in the wintertime is discuss what is our biggest problem, and then we would create a meeting around that focus where we would find resource people, we would find researchers at Cornell who worked in the field. We would invite them, and it turned into like a potluck where everybody brought something to eat. We would spend the morning with the experts, and then we would spend the afternoon basically pulling the tables in a circle and discussing the problem. And it's amazing how many agronomic problems were solved in that circle. The model of the expert being in front and talking to everybody else and giving pearls of wisdom doesn't work nearly as good as when you've got the idea of we're all in this together and everybody has something to contribute. And I could see a need from just where you are in the state to possibly having meetings like that where the farmers decide what is it we need to know. You know, what is our biggest impediment, and can we put together a set of resources for solving it? The self-help really works. The other thing that group did was we started inviting our conventional neighbors, and especially the first meeting. Oh, you're not trying to convert me into one of you guys, are you? No, we just want you to come, and we're talking about, and we would describe the problem. And quite a few of these people became organic farmers just because they liked being in a group where everybody wanted them to succeed. You know, where they got that encouragement and that feeling of community. One of these farmers who walked in came with his banker. And at the time, he didn't know it and we didn't know it. The banker came to a meeting a couple years later and said, you know, we were just discussing whether to pull the plug on Rod. And at that meeting, we decided that it was worth giving him another shot. And he pulled out and actually became one of their big success stories because of the markets that he gained and the success that he got by making a few changes that turned his farm around. And I thought that was kind of inspiring that farmers, we can fix our own problems. We can deal with our own challenges. So back to working with other farmers, we had this problem where we had the main crop that made us money, being the Vinton 81 soybean, and everybody was trying to figure out ways to game the system and grow more Vinton 81s. We had several local cleaning plants, seed cleaning plants, that had gotten certified organic for the Japanese market. And after about 4 or 5 years of really, we were getting $23, $24 a bushel. This is back when soybeans were 4 and 5. We started having some beans that had a brown stain on them. The brown stain was a bean mosaic virus. And all of a sudden we started getting rejections where we'd send our beans to the cleaning plant and the Japanese buyer would get the sample and send it back saying, we don't want these. The bean mosaic virus had made them so that they weren't marketable. Now we were lucky because at that time, remember the Alar scare? Right after the Alar scare, people started wanting organic milk. And there were a small number of farmers in New York had gotten together with their milk processor, gotten certified organic, and suddenly they needed feed. And they came out to the western New York where there was a group of farmers who were growing feed grains, and they said, well, can we work together? And one of the guys in the group had a blower truck and a mixer grinder, and I organized it, and we started producing feed for these farmers in the eastern part of the state. Now that was a windfall because suddenly we had a way to market these beans, these Vintons, that were unacceptable. But we also suddenly had a new demand for feed grains. That created a market for some things that we weren't getting a good price. We were able to sell them, but we weren't getting as good a price as we wanted. Price of corn then, at that point, went to double what our conventional corn had been. That had us all smiling pretty good. And I started working on, and this is some of the ag economics work, what should organic corn be worth? And what we found was that we were a deficit area because organic dairy was growing rapidly. And we could take what is the price of organic corn out here in Indiana, and we looked at what is the price of organic corn in Michigan. We looked at what it was in Nebraska, and we did the same with beans. Any place where there was availability of organic feed, we added freight. And we came up with this basis map that we could figure out what our price ought to be based on what you could buy stuff for elsewhere and what it would cost to get it to New York. And that worked really well for us as a price discovery tool. Fast forward, the local Agway elevator, the co-op went bankrupt, and I was friends with one of the executives at Agway who had been the manager of this local store. And he contacted us, and he just wanted to unload the property. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, what do we want with the local co-op? It might be enough work here for someone to run part-time, but we sure don't need this big place. And then he said, and I only want $45,000 for it. I just got to get it off our books. It had a grain elevator, it had grain bins on it, and it had a grain dryer. It was a steal. So all of a sudden, we owned this rat-infested abandoned elevator. In fact, the first time I cleaned it up, it would have looked like the Pied Piper in reverse, because I had this manure spreader loaded with rotten grain, and the rodents were jumping off it as I was driving down Main Street. But that was a humble beginning. But that elevator turned into Lakeview Organic Grain. And it started making some real prosperity because it created a way that farmers in our part of the state that had surplus grain could market to the farmers in the other part of the state who were producing milk. And of course, you know about the growth of organic. It was growing at 20% a year. Our grain sales, after we bought the elevator, started growing at 20% a month. And that really challenged us. Our farm couldn't begin to grow anywhere near what we needed. Now, my wife took that over, and it's a good thing she's a better elevator operator than I am, because I would have bankrupted it. But that was another story. Anyway, we started working very closely with Cornell, because back to the problem of not having information, we needed to know, why are these Vinton 81s suddenly not marketable? What's going on? And what we discovered was we were growing too many soybeans too close together. The food grade soybeans are fussier. They have more problems. They're more sensitive. They're higher in protein. So they're the canary in the coal mine. They were telling us this soil does not want to grow soybeans 2 years out of 3. It doesn't even want to grow soybeans 2 years out of 2. We shouldn't have soybeans more than maybe 1 year out of 4 or 5. The nice thing is we had alternatives. And back to the phone calls that I was getting, the market for organic wheat for flour, the market for dry beans popped up. And the first years that we grew dry beans, it was really a bonanza. We were, at that time, getting 3 times as much per bushel for kidney beans as we were getting for soybeans. $40 to $60 a bushel was a normal price for kidney beans. And I mentioned yesterday that I started growing too many kidney beans. I think I would have learned on the soybeans. And the kidney bean yields dropped, and they dropped, and they dropped until we learned that the problem is we had too many legumes on the farm. This is going to turn into a repeating theme. So I'm going to shift over to what Cornell had done. At that time, there were 2 professors, Chuck Moeller, who was, everyone called him a weed scientist, but he was actually hired as a weed ecologist. That was kind of a radical idea, because we had our weed scientists too who figured out what sprays to use, but a weed ecologist was a little hard to understand what he was really doing. But he was studying how weeds and crops interacted, how weeds interacted with each other. And Lori Drinkwater, who was a really brilliant soil microbiologist, they got a grant to set up a systems trial. So we're talking about farming systems. They were, their inspiration and what they wrote the grant for was to take a piece of the college farm, transition it to organic, and managing it as close as they could to how the real organic farmers were managing theirs. And take a lot of good data so that they could start answering some of the questions that we were asking them. They created a farmer advisory council, and this raised a few eyebrows in academia, because instead of writing up, we're going to manage this farm and have it all planned out 5 years ahead, the day-to-day management was designed by the farmers. And when there were questions or when the weather wasn't right, instead of going back to the plan, they would ask, what would you do as a farmer? So they tried very hard to make this systems trial be as close as possible to mimicking a real farm, both in what was planted and how it was managed. And this turned out to be really valuable for us first organic farmers, because the university was running a system that mimicked ours. And they were able to try things that we didn't want to lose money trying, but they were also willing to go out there and take the data and make the observations that we didn't have time to make or that we weren't disciplined enough to write down when we saw them. And I've got to say it was a very successful project, a very successful idea, because we went from where they were following us, where the systems trial was actually running into every problem we found on our farms at about the same point, to where they started leading us, where they were starting to try new things that we could then incorporate on our farms. But one of the first problems that they ran into, and it came a little quicker on the university farm because another side story, that when they went to the farm manager had a field that was fouled with perennial weeds, and he was getting lousy yields on it, and it needed drainage, but nobody was going to pay for draining that plot. And he said, that's going to be the organic experiment. Because all the professors that had more pull got the good pieces of ground. And they set the systems trial up with a rotation. We thought it was a diverse rotation. Shows how little we knew. It was, and I heard about it yesterday right here. Corn, soybeans, wheat or spelt, which is another wheat subspecies, underseeded to clover, then back to corn. It was a successful experiment because that's what most of us were doing on our farms. We were still trying to maximize how often we were planting soybeans. This farm went into transition at 2 points. And I think for you farmers who are in transition here, this was important. They did economic analysis on it. They also pulled together what's called a program work team, where we had every discipline that was connected with farming was involved on the university side studying the data. So we didn't just have the wheat ecologist and the agronomist, but we had the ag economist involved. We had the microbiologist. We even had some people who were studying soil physics, all working on this bigger project. And the fact that this field already had perennial weeds in it kind of hastened the process of running into the problems that we were finding. In our farm, we started seeing a buildup after about the second cycle of Canada thistle and south thistle coming in the winter grain. And the Canada thistle and the south thistle in the winter grain were getting worse every time we went through the cycle. And it finally got bad enough on our farm, I said, we got to do something different. This is not going to work. Cornell got there right a year or two later than we were. What we tried the first year was I said, why don't we try growing a crop that would mimic the life cycle, or that would mismatch the life cycle of the pest. Sorry, these pictures are more so that you don't have to look at me to rest your eyes. But if we mismatch the life cycle of the pest, maybe I can grow crops on this land without having these perennial weeds bother us. So I tried something with advice from a farmer in Canada who had he was actually from Germany originally. And he said, European farmers often grow 2 winter grains in a row. And he said, by the way, barley can be grown as the second winter grain. You can't grow wheat after wheat because of disease issues, because of contamination issues. So if you're going to grow more than 1 winter grain in sequence, the first one, wheat always has to be the first one, or spelt. But you can get away with putting barley in, or triticale, as the second winter grain. We tried winter barley. Now, there were several reasons for doing this. I talked about it yesterday, that our winter barley matures in our area at a time when the Canada thistle is blooming. And by cutting it when it's in bloom, we're taking it when it's weakest. We also subsoiled the ground after taking off the winter barley, and we double cropped, planted a crop of buckwheat. Now, we knew buckwheat had a lot of attributes. The old farmers where we lived used to, this was before the days of Roundup, if somebody had a field that was overrun with quackgrass, they would say, okay, we'll just grow a crop of buckwheat and it'll get rid of the quackgrass. And it actually does. It's absolutely amazing after you've grown a crop of buckwheat in a field that was followed with quackgrass, that the quackgrass just totally disappears. So we put the buckwheat in as the next crop, and then we went to a winter grain and seeded it to clover like we had before. And the perennial weeds almost disappeared. So I brought this up at the next farmer meeting on the systems trial, and our weed ecologist, who's a very good friend of mine, but I can still see him take a deep breath and saying, "That's never gonna work. Those weeds have such deep reserves, just changing something for a year is not gonna do a thing." At the end of the cycle, when we finished, I prevailed, I'm pretty stubborn, and that's what we did. At the end of the cycle, the report came back saying, we've gotten rid of our perennial weeds and now we can go back to our original rotation plan. Just 1 year later. But I spoke up, and so did the other farmers, saying, why would we want to go back to the rotation that caused the problem? Not only that, but we were making money on this new crop. So the Cornell systems trial went from 4 species, 3 years. We added barley, we added buckwheat, and we actually made triticale being another winter grain. So we added 3 species and went to a 4th year, or actually went to a 5th year in the cycle. So it started to get more diverse. And that was our first big problem that we had solved. And I can't bore you with all the details that we learned and all the mistakes we made, but I will bring you, we grow paddy soybeans in New York once in a while when it's wet. What we did find kind of fit a pattern, and there's a general rule that I've learned, and I'm skipping way forward on this, and that's whenever we had a really serious agronomic problem on our farm or anywhere in the field, if we could introduce the right new species, we could eliminate the problem. And that was kind of a revolutionary idea, that we could eliminate a pest just by mixing up the system. You know, originally we were looking at, well, we're mismatching the life cycle, or we're finding some way that the pest just can't get started. But what we really did, we were biologically changing the soil. And that was taking care of the problem. So this is what our land looks like, and it may be deceiving. It looks almost as flat in the picture as it does here, but there's a slope there of about 5%. You have to tip the picture to see. And that gave us a challenge in New York, because you can't farm big areas on that kind of slope and not have any soil left. But that was just another issue that we were working through. This is one of our best friends. And in the Cornell research, they found that we had 0 reduction in corn yield due to nitrogen if we had a stand of at least 60% clover in the cover crop. In fact, by the second cycle in the Cornell systems trial, our yields of corn were equal to the conventional yields of corn. In fact, a little further on, we found that there was a pattern. In wet years, our yields were about 20% below, 10 to 20% below conventional yields. And the farm manager always said, well, that's because GMO crops in conventional farming yields higher. But then we started having some droughts, and the organic yields were 20 bushels higher than the conventional, or 20% higher than the conventional yields. And then he said, well, that's just because of the weather this year. Always an explanation when you make an observation like that. But the bigger point is that this systems trial was matching yield for corn and soybeans with the conventional corn and soybeans on the university farm, even though it was not on as good a land. And what was happening there, and this is where we bring in the other disciplines, we were doing a lot of work at that time with the soil health test. Cornell pioneered a set of tests that are now being used pretty widely as soil health tests. The reason that happened was that New York had originally been a huge producer of processing vegetables and a huge producer of edible dry beans. We used to be the biggest in this country before the bigger western states started getting into it. but we had hit a brick wall on yields. And originally, as our pesticides got better and as our fertilizer management got better, we were able to deal with the pest problems and the disease problems in these vegetables and keep our yields coming up. And it seemed like by the mid-70s, our yields hit a plateau. And then they started going down. And then the acreage where you could grow these crops started shrinking. That when fields had the yields drop far enough, farmers would stop growing those sensitive crops on them. And the acreage where we could grow vegetables and beans kept getting less. And farmers started going to our extension specialist and saying, well, we need better pesticides, we need better herbicides, we need better fungicides, because why are our yields dropping? And at that time, we pulled together, this would have been in the 80s that started, but in the 90s it really cranked up because the yields had seriously taken hits. And we were asking a question of why have processing vegetable yields started to drop? Why have dry bean yields plateaued and dropped? And the answer was soil health. That when we farm, I said yesterday, you never swim in the same river twice, you never farm the same soil twice, because everything we do changes it. The farming methods we had been using, the heavy tillage, the very low organic matter incorporation from these vegetable crops, had changed the soil. And the soil had gotten so that these crops that I call the canaries in the coal mine, the ones that really need healthier soil conditions, just weren't able to maintain their health anymore. They weren't able to maintain their yields because the soil wasn't the same as it had been when we first were growing them. We started coming up with some tests for measuring that. Things like aggregate stability, rainfall, rain storage. You can go to the Soil Health Institute now and get a list of these soil health measurements. And what's important about these tests and these measurements is that until the 60s, our limiting factor was probably fertility. And we got very good at doing chemical soil tests and finding our most yield limiting factor in a fertilizer bag. But by the 70s and 80s, we had done a good enough job with our fertility that our yield limiting factor was no longer chemical. It was physical and biological. And I'm sure you've all seen the Venn diagram of the circle or the triangle of chemical, physical, biological. I think that diagram is actually misleading. What we've learned is that the biological is a much bigger force than the chemical and the physical. But they're all tied together. When you change one, you change all of them. I really think some of these diverse crops are pretty. I've got a friend, I'm digressing here, but Dan Barber is considered the top chef in the country. He wanted to figure out a way to use this in one of his meals. And he's charging people phenomenal dollars per cup for clover tea now, drying out clover blossoms. This is Austrian winter peas. And this is just one of the side things that we learned. When Dan was visiting our farm one time, he saw those peas and he jumped out of the car. You got to know this guy. He's a kind of over the top in terms of excitement and enthusiasm. And he started picking these Austrian winter peas. And he ran, when we got back to the farm, he ran into the kitchen and without asking, grabbed a skillet and started frying them up. And he's now growing them in the garden and making salads out of them. So these soil building cover crops are actually ending up on plates. That's not a practical, nobody's going to be growing Austrian winter peas out here on a big scale. But you would be surprised how many market gardeners have discovered that they can plant this as a cover crop to build their soil and for several months be able to take the pea shoots and sell them for big money in the farmer's market. What have I done there? Anyway, if you have questions and would like me to go either deeper into something or change the direction, feel free to interrupt. I love interruptions. But what we had come to up to this point in the Cornell systems trial was we were growing a lot of different species, but they were still legumes and grasses. They were only 2 plant families. And one of the factors behind the declining yields in dry beans, which would also include snap beans, the vegetable, was that we were starting to see root rots building up. These root rots were really serious. It was Fusarium, Pythium, Rhizoctonia. When you had a wet year, the roots would just rot right off the plants. And of course, you don't get much of a yield on a plant that had the roots rot off it. Dr. Abawi, again, I apologize for those who were here yesterday, but I think I have to cover that ground again to explain how we got there, had been working on declining dry bean yields. And he did something absolutely brilliant. He asked the question, when we've got these fields where we can't grow dry beans anymore, what would happen if we mixed up the previous crop, if we changed the previous crop? And he did a large experiment. It was a 10-acre field, random block, and he planted 22 different in-between crops in this replicated 3 times, randomized through the whole field. Then he went back the next year and planted a very sensitive variety of kidney beans. And he had this whole thing, now we can do it with GPS, and it's a lot cheaper, but he had this whole thing measured out, and it was a very expensive experiment. And then he dug up the plants to analyze the roots. And what he saw was, of all these different species, there were some of the species actually made the root rot worse. Some of the species that he had in between were neutral. Some of them improved it, and 2 of them virtually eliminated the root rot complex. And what's more, he discovered there were nematodes involved. So the pathogenic nematodes were abrading the roots, and then the diseases were able to move in a lot more strongly. The 2 species that he found that controlled the problem were yellow mustard and buckwheat. And herein comes an interesting story, 2 totally different modes of action. Yellow mustard has been well studied since then. When you plow it in, the sharp flavor, like when you put mustard on your hot dog, that's a molecule called glucosinolate. And there's an enzyme in the leaves that will clip the glucosinolate, and it gives off cyanide. When we plowed in the mustard, we were fumigating the soil. And Michigan State did some interesting work, that the fumigation we got from mustard didn't seem to kill everything, but it seemed to kill the pathogens. And that was just a really effective control. And we were having this problem on our farm. So this is where Cornell started getting ahead of the farmers and started leading in helping us deal with our agricultural problems. He said, I want you to plant a cover crop of mustard. Of course, that got him a few looks, because what farmer wants to plant mustard on their farm? But we did it. And he said, but I want you to leave control strips. I don't want you to just plant mustard. I want to be able to come out there and see what difference it made. And more important, I want you to see what difference it made. And we did that the first year. And he went out with a group of graduate students, and they dug up roots. And sure enough, there was a huge change in root health where we had the cover crop. And it wasn't a very good cover crop that we had plowed in, but where we did, you could see it very clearly, that there was just a lot healthier root systems, a lot bigger roots, and a much higher yield on those plants. Then he got me to try buckwheat. Buckwheat works on a totally different mode of action. What we learned about buckwheat was that the buckwheat roots give off exudates, and the exudates seem to recruit an organism that gives off an enzyme called chitinase. Now, chitin is in the cell wall of the fungi. These bugs around the buckwheat roots were hunting down and eating the root rot organisms and digesting them. So by adding those 2 species, 2 years later, our dry bean yields had more than doubled. This was just by improving soil health. That was a big revelation for our farm. And if you look at it, we thought we had a lot of diversity. But we were diverse in species, but we had 2 plant families. What he was doing was getting us to add a Brassica crop. we didn't have any brassicas. In fact, what I should have been noticing, but I wasn't connecting it, was we started having trouble with mustard growing in our cornfields. Nature was actually trying to grow the crop we needed. The brassicas were starting to come in as weeds. So our fields were trying to add biodiversity, but to me that was nothing but an annoyance that we had to go kill with a weeder. Of course, it does make a difference if we plant it as a cover crop when it's not going to hurt our crop yield, and terminate it before it makes seed. And we were very careful to use yellow mustard, a cultivated type, that doesn't have hard seed in it so that it couldn't become a weed. I was a lot more worried about that back then than I am now. But this is just some examples of brassicas. And I know some of you are using tillage radish. I think we could be doing a lot more with brassicas, and you think about your crop mix, that's a plant family that's not being used enough on our farms. This is a better stand of mustard than I got when I first started. Mustard really loves nitrogen. Mustard really loves sulfur. And I learned something from the biodynamic farmers, that when we have yellow flowered weeds popping up in our fields, that it's an indication that we've got an issue where we're short of sulfur. And I had another factor going on our farm that I wasn't aware of that I'll share with you. We had been using layer manure almost exclusively, and I heard yesterday a lot of you are using layer manure on your farms. We were using it because it was the cheapest source of phosphorus. What I wasn't paying attention to was the layer manure that we were using was 7% calcium. Some of it was even higher. Some of it was between 8 and 9% calcium. If you look at limestone, it's calcium carbonate, but when you take the carbonate out, limestone runs between, what would it be, 22 to 25% calcium? This layer manure had highly soluble calcium in it, and every ton of chicken manure we were putting on was like throwing on 1/3 of a ton of active limestone. Our pHs were 7 when we started, and they were pushing 7.5 and 8 very shortly after. We had been over applying calcium, and it was causing a sulfur deficiency. Now you've all seen the barrel with the lowest stave, where we talk about the most limiting mineral being the one that's shortest. And this goes way back to one of the first German scientists who worked with fertilizer. His name was Justus von Liebig. And he had the theory of that the most limiting, whatever nutrient is shortest, limits your yield. A less known concept came from Andre Voisin, and he wrote a pamphlet. Von Liebig called it the law of the minimum. Voisin wrote a pamphlet a few years later that he had called the law of the maximum. What he observed was that when you have a mineral in excess, that it can cause a tie-up of something else. That was actually more important. That's what we were doing. We had pushed our calciums way in excess of where they needed to be and created a sulfur deficiency. We not only created a sulfur deficiency, but we were starting to incorporate animals at the time. And I was noticing that our cows were getting parasites. Our calves were getting coccidiosis. And the heifers were licking at the wood, they were licking at the dirt. What our nutritionists finally confirmed was that we had a severe copper deficiency, we had an iron deficiency, we had a phosphorus deficiency. And it was because our calciums had pushed so high. Everybody here's seen the charts that show with pH, there's all the minerals, they show like a band, and it's wide in one spot and then it gets narrower. Well, the phosphorus always confused me, and some of the modern books actually have changed it, and I think they're wrong. Phosphorus is most available, at least in our soils, at about 5.8 to 6.2. The reason is when our calcium and magnesium levels get high enough to push the pH up towards 7, we're making the phosphorus is going into tricalcium phosphate. That's a form that a legume has no trouble getting phosphorus from, but grasses can't, because the acids that corn roots and grass roots give out are not very efficient at breaking that bond. What we had done was tied up our phosphorus in the form of tricalcium phosphate, but we'd also tied up our copper, we'd tied up our iron, Iron is very available at low pH, but it becomes less and less available as the pH goes up. We had created this tie-up. It showed in our weeds, it showed in our animal health, and at the same time we'd made this other problem. It's amazing how many mistakes I made. I call that paying my tuition in the College of Hard Knocks. Actually, when we pay that tuition, we hopefully remember it longer. But if we don't learn from it, we've wasted our money on that school. Yes? Okay, the question is, what did we do? And Neil Kinsey wrote about this, and this is one of those interesting things. I read that in his book, I'll bet 6 times, and never sank into me what it meant. So he said, if we keep using layer manure, we're going to eventually screw up our land if we're using it in large amounts. But he said if you use broiler manure or turkey litter, you're going to drop your calcium. And he was recommending that we use soil tests and choose our poultry litter according to our fertility. So he had us switch to using broiler manure. He also had us use some gypsum, but more importantly, we were so high in calcium already that we were using more elemental sulfur. The elemental sulfur helped. We changed our starter fertilizer in the corn, and we got a major bump in our corn yield when we started putting Chilean nitrate in the band and 10 pounds of elemental sulfur. In fact, I had always been struggling. Our soils are very high in lime, and they're high in pH. And when I was conventional, I would put 170 pounds of MAP down, and I would still have purple corn on us, in the spring if it was cold. Since I started putting the sulfur in the band, the sulfur was breaking the tricalcium phosphate bonds and making it available. I haven't seen purple corn, even though I'm putting a lot less phosphorus in my band, since we've been acidifying that band with sulfur. Also, since we've started paying attention to our soil tests more as a way to avoid putting on too much of something instead of just worrying about what are we shortest on. And I'm using soil tests more now to avoid putting on something that I've got too much of than I do for figuring out what I'm shortest on. It's amazing how biology can fix a lot of these things. Has anyone here ever had alfalfa run out and suddenly get dandelions in it? It's very common in New York, and we used to say the dandelions crowded out the alfalfa. That's not what was happening. If we're short of soluble calcium, you can actually have soil tests, because we're using a strong acid doing the soil test, show the calcium real high, but have a shortage of soluble calcium, the alfalfa will fail and the dandelions come in as an opportunist. But the dandelions have yellow blossoms. They've got a deep taproot. They're getting the soluble calcium, and they're getting the calcium is soluble because they're getting some sulfur and bringing it up. So we had cause and effect backwards in doing that. This is a crop that we've been using, especially for no-till, the tillage radish. And how many of you have got tillage radish that looks like that? Have you ever seen tillage radish where it doesn't stick out of the ground at all? I've now successfully grown tillage radish that had 0 sticking out of the ground. And it bothered me. It seemed like on some of our neighbors' farms, especially the ones that weren't paying attention, weren't putting a lot of cover crops in, weren't using a lot of organic matter, and they would dump some fertilizer around with a tillage radish, and I thought those fields looked like fat men that couldn't pull their pants on. They just had this huge chunk of radish sticking up out of the ground. I think what we were seeing there was that the radish couldn't get into the ground, so it was growing above ground. And it had plenty of fertility. In a really healthy soil, those radishes will actually be flat in the ground, and they'll go deeper. Of course, they're helping open the ground up, but the big thing is we need to make sure we're not closing it back up after they've done their job. We need to be working with them. It's interesting too, and I'm sorry I'm skipping all over, but these ideas come to me, and I think some of them are significant. I was at a farm foundation meeting once, and Joe Clapperton was there, and Jimmy Kinder, who is a friend from Oklahoma, and he put up a picture. There's a group of like 200 farmers, and he said, I really believe in no-till, I really believe in cover crops, but will somebody help me explain what happened? And he put in a mixture of 7 cover crops, and he said it cut his wheat yield in half. This was on a dry year when yields were low anyway. And we all stood there, including me, like, Jill Clapperton put her hand up and said, I see all of your cover crops have the same root structure. You might have had a diversity in species, but maybe you should have had your cover crop mix designed for a diversity in root structure. And she was right. In fact, Jimmy confirmed afterwards that when they started looking at the cover crop mix to have fibrous roots, tap roots, branching roots, to have more of a diversity of roots, it helped loosen the ground. And we ended up with wheat roots that could go in deeper and got better access to water. I know we all love the way this looks, and I'm going to make another jump here on soil health. And Margaret Sakara, who I quoted yesterday, described what happens when it rains. And I think this is another very important concept for us that tells us why we need to keep the soil covered. When you get a hard rain, we've got aggregates, and they break down. What soil particles make water muddy? You seldom have sand floating in water. That doesn't make it muddy. Some of the clay, but silt, at least where we are, our soil has a lot of silt. But the silt makes the water look muddy, right? And if your soil is working properly to infiltrate water, that water carrying silt and clay goes down. What happens when it comes to a texture change, where it slows down? Silts out, right? Have you ever seen that happen in your fields? If you've got water standing, muddy water standing after a hard rain, does it ever look really shiny on top? You're all lucky if you've never had it look shiny on top. But that shiny layer is the silt that settled out of the standing water. Once more, when that happens, usually the crop looks a little peaked afterwards, doesn't it? Because that silt closed up the ability of the soil to breathe. It closed off the capillaries. The CO2 in the ground, the ethylene, methane, all those things are trapped, and the oxygen can't get in. And when you look at soil life, most of our beneficials are aerobic. And I had a speaker once at one of our NYCO meetings. Somebody asked him about this and said, why does the crop look so rough when we've had this hard rain and it's shiny on top? And he said, well, how long can you live without food? Probably a month. How long can you live without water? About 3 days. And he said, how long can you live without air? And he said, that's the same thing with your aerobic soil life. We have to have soil that provides the conditions for our microbes to grow. But the surface, you can see when it does that. But the next place, where is the next place in the soil where the water changes speed? Going down. Secondary tillage layer, right? You've got a texture change there. It silts out, and you get a layer of silt depositing right at that texture change. Where do we have the most serious texture change? And I think we've been blaming it on the wrong thing for a long time. Anyone hear of a plow pan? I think the plow pan is probably the most impressive texture change. Never made sense to me. They used to say it was compaction. That's what I learned in soils class. Never made sense. Why would a tractor that has a tire in the furrow, every third furrow when it was a 3-bottom or every 5th furrow, why would that give me a uniform hard layer of compaction? That just never quite fit what I was seeing. But if you think about water getting down to that layer, carrying a load of silt, or silt and clay, and then depositing it because it's slowed down. That makes sense. And I've gone to putting a T-handle. We don't need the fancy penetrometer with the scale on top. I can feel when the ground gets tighter. It's sometimes nice to have it to measure, but the numbers don't always mean anything because it depends on moisture. But we've started carrying a probe with a T-handle, and we could feel a layer at about 4 inches, which was the secondary tillage layer. This is back when we were farming and plowing, doing pretty much what we used to do. And then we'd hit the hard layer around 8 inches because we were plowing 8 inches deep. That sound familiar? What happens when you go through that second hard layer with the penetrometer? Anyone here done that? Suddenly, once you got through that, you fall. But when we dig up plants in a soil pit, we see the roots being pretty profuse in the top 2 to 4 inches, and sometimes it looks just like someone shaved them off. That's that transition we get from tillage. There's actually, he lives in Indiana now. He was somebody that, he was a teacher when I went to college, Jim Martindale, did an experiment where he took soil and he broke it into 1 inch increments. He took a core and he sifted the cores, and he saw the silt amount when he was separating it for size suddenly spiked at 4 inches, and then it had a bigger spike at 8 inches. He found the silt. What we were doing on our farm, again, this is paying tuition. I had a guy working for me, and he loved to go to the coffee shop, and they all liked to brag about how straight the furrows are, how clean it was inverted, and how deep they were plowing, how much smoke the tractor was putting out. And I would tell him, I don't think we should be going so deep. And I got to get some of that miserable stuff and make it into topsoil. Well, what was really happening, he was bringing unaggregated soil to the top, getting a rain in it, and it was falling apart instantly and putting a big load of silt right back in. That same layer of silt was being brought up and going back down, and being brought up and going back down. But each time it killed our soil life and destroyed our structure every year. That's that cycle of being hooked on tillage. If you looked at Europe, back 100 years ago, people who built plows did not try to invert. They actually designed the plow so that it would only turn the bottom of the furrow halfway, 90 degrees. And then a little higher up, it would invert, it was variable geometry. What they were trying to do was have a layer of soil, a layer of organic material, layer of soil, layer of organic material. That was to create a wick that allowed air up and down into the ground. It also deepened the layer. They were still getting a plow pan because of to whatever depth they were plowing. Now, Margaret Sakara, who I've quoted, had a rule in her book that European farmers followed, at least the good ones, said you never till soil deeper than it's already well aggregated. That when you till beyond the layer that's aggregated, you're bringing up soil that's subject to damage and actually destroying the live soil. And we just talked about losing oxygen. That's a process of repeatedly damaging the soil more. We were hooked on that process. We weren't paying attention. Yes?
The obvious question is, how do you get rid of it?
The question is, how do we get rid of it? I believe that biology can do more than any other thing. That's part of why what I was leading up to with these different cover crops and different crops. Incidentally, the soil doesn't know or care whether we call something a cover crop or a crop. The soil just knows what it's doing. So back to some basic soils.
Klaas,
Yes.
if we could wrap up.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Just a couple minutes.
Yeah, this is probably not a bad place to wrap up on this. So every species of plant recruits a group of microbes around its roots. And that group that it recruits are fed by the exudates. Some species actually give off half of the sugars they make as root exudates. And those plants aren't stupid to give away all that energy because the microbes in the soil are providing a surface for it, or a service in return for it. Some of them create immunity in the plant. Some of them help solubilize fertility. But a lot of them build soil structure. And these stable aggregates, I think we've been getting it wrong. We're treating soil like it's bricks and mortar and that the life lives in the spaces in between. The life is actually building the structure. We can all look at, we know certain species will make the soil very mellow, very well aggregated. Certain species tend to break down like vegetables. You lose aggregation. So one way we can deal with this is to try to always have something living growing. And incidentally, if you cut off the supply of the food after a few months, you're starving too. Why are we growing a crop for 4 months, paying taxes for 12 months, but we're starving our soil life when we don't have living plants pushing out exudates? So I think a big thing we can do is understanding the biology and always having the soil covered with something living, always having something in the ground that is giving off these sugars that feed the microbes that will then maintain the soil. So I guess I ought to open it up to questions. Sorry for going so long.
Yeah, we've already gone over quite a bit. I was going to pose one question that came through about how do you terminate red clover, and I was going to kind of expand that to your your thoughts on and how you manage on your farm balancing tillage to terminate things like red clover, but balancing it with what you're talking about with soil life. So maybe just a brief.
So
That's a big question, but keep it.
It's hard to keep. You need to have a hook for me anyway.
Yeah. It's hard.
So we have bought European plows. We got rid of our whites and IHs. And Kverneland actually made an Iowa bottom because American farmers were demanding a bottom that imitated what their bad ones were doing. But if you use the European S8 moldboard and they make another one that's called an Echo, boy, I'm not even sure what, but it's a different plow that's designed for plowing only 2 inches deep. But we try to go 4 to 5 inches and not deeper than our aggregation is and turn it. What we're finding is after a huge rain, you get rows of earthworm holes opening up within minutes or hours after the rain stops because we've got the soil, it's a vertical tillage. But I think vertical tillage in general is a way that'll help us deal with this problem. But the biology is huge. And there's one species that we're not using much in the United States, and I hear you're using it here, is the canola or forage rape. In Europe, the farmers have noticed that forage rape will make roots, and we tried it. 45 days, it'll put a root the diameter of a pencil in the ground, about a foot. But what's more important, even though it's a non-mycorrhizal plant, the forage rape root will build a beautiful aggregation around itself. And one of the recommendations that Sakara made was to try to incorporate a head of root crops. In Europe, they grow a lot of beets, a lot of potatoes, a lot of root crops, to try to have at some point ahead of the root crop, a crop that'll build a deep aggregation so that you're not trying to break the ground up with a plow, but your ground is already loose. So I think that if we could do more research on the effects of these different species on the soil, we could probably do a soil health test and do a prescriptive cover crop mixture that will address the most limiting yield factors. That, to me, that would be a real win-win.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that. I'm sure you have a lot of questions on your mind, plenty that you want to ask. We started a little bit late. We ran into this first break a little bit. I'm sure everybody's fine with that. That clock is fast, about 4 minutes, the one in the back of the room. Our morning breakout sessions are scheduled to start at 10:15. We've got about 15 minutes until then. So in here, we'll have Megan Wallendal Farms. In the small breakout room, we'll have Ryan Corey with Marcaris Dr. Langemeyer from Purdue, organic commodity update and farm bill program update. After those, we'll be back in here to hear more from Klaas. So if you've got questions and things, we can bring them back for that last session in the morning. Okay? Let's show Klaas our appreciation.